That's nice. You know, a guy's word is his bond.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, accused Donald Trump of behaving dishonorably. And this is not a joke, these are his exact words. After the failed 35-minute meeting in Manila, where Lavrov and Mark Rubio parted ways without any results, the Kremlin publicly lashed out at Donald Trump. Sergei Lavrov directly accused Washington of breaking the Anchorage agreements and stated that Russia kept its word, but the US, as he put it, didn't behave honorably. I will quote him in full in this episode because it's worth it to understand the level of diplomacy in Russia. This is just plain riffraff, never mind ordinary Russians, but Lavrov shouldn't be speaking like that, just like that. Mark Rubio basically told him to get lost yesterday in Manila, and we'll talk about that in this episode as well. On the other hand, at the same time, Elon Musk joined the game, a man who, a month ago, briefly became the world's first trillionaire. It seems he also turned his attention to Ukraine. But in an interview with The Economist, he stated that the war will not end until the West makes concessions to Russia and Ukraine makes concessions personally to Vladimir Putin. And he also took a swipe at, as he put it, the sophisticated diplomats who conduct negotiations in expensive restaurants. That's a quote as well. And today, Elon Musk let something slip, and it became clear exactly which news sources he reads. Well, the story is completely different on the third track of negotiations. Volodymyr Zelensky announced that he is flying to the US, where the Americans promised to show him some of their new plans to end the war. We will make a separate episode about this visit, but today we will analyze what is happening on the Moscow track and why the Kremlin suddenly changed its tone towards Donald Trump, and what effects this could have on him overall. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are moving towards the mark of 300,000 subscribers, so I would be grateful for your subscription. It only takes a second, and for us, it will be very helpful. So, I'll start with what triggered a real diplomatic scandal today. So, yesterday, July 23rd in Manila, on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Forum, there was the first in almost a year face-to-face meeting between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and US Secretary of State Mark Rubio. This meeting lasted 35 minutes and ended with absolutely nothing. After it, Mark Rubio made a statement that was perceived in Moscow as a slap in the face. The U.S. Secretary of State publicly admitted that no attempts by the Americans to reach an agreement with the Russians, not even the personal meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Anchorage last year, worked. His wording was as follows, quote, "You can't reach a peace agreement if both sides don't agree to it, and the Ukrainians would not have agreed to it, and that's exactly why that attempt didn't work." Well, plus Marco Rubio said at the time that new ideas and new concepts are needed because the old proposals for Ukraine are unacceptable and will become even less acceptable in the future. And that's exactly what set the Kremlin off. Because yesterday Lavrov started telling everyone fairy tales again, claiming that supposedly in Alaska Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin agreed to give up Ukraine, signed some agreements, and so on. Lavrov's response came today to all of Marco Rubio's statements. And today, July 24th, after the meeting of SCO foreign ministers in Kyrgyzstan, he stated that, "Damn, the Americans betrayed us." And he started by basically shifting all the blame to Washington. Here is his quote. "Regarding the fact that the Anchorage understandings have failed, we probably need to understand who exactly failed. Although I want to emphasize once again, Vladimir Putin himself admitted a month ago that there really were no agreements in Alaska. So what could have possibly failed here? But here comes that very quote from Sergei Lavrov, which showed that Russians are nervous, Russians are angry, and Russians are confused. Because when they get nervous, their true nature comes out, that of ordinary riffraff. When they are calm, they pretend to be diplomatic, that they are capable of having a reasonable dialogue, but as soon as they start getting nervous, their riffraff nature comes out. Well, Remember Lavrov, he constantly calls someone idiots, swears always when he gets nervous. And now I'll give you a direct quote from Sergei Lavrov. Our conscience is clear. You know, as they say in Slovo Patsana, a guy said it, a guy did it, we said it, we're ready. Well, on the other side, this approach has been modified, judging by the quote from Mark Rubio. But the tasks set by President Putin in June 2024, as he has repeatedly emphasized, will be fulfilled. Just listen to how the foreign minister of a nuclear power, which considers itself a civilization, explains its position to the world, using a gangster saying from a TV series about teenage gangs. Slovo Patsana is literally the level of diplomacy in today's Russia. And the funniest thing is that Russian commentators themselves noticed all this. In the comments under the articles where these words of Sergei Lavrov are mentioned, people write that this phrase, a guy said, a guy did, is all you need to know about the current level of Russian diplomacy. Once again, this is a diplomat. He is the main representative of all of Russia on the international stage. He says, those Americans didn't play by the code, but our mobbed-up guys wouldn't do that. Then Lavrov laid out his line of accusations, and according to him, Russia came to the summit in Anchorage with proposals from the US that had been sent in advance and personally approved by Trump. So, according to Moscow's version, they didn't come up with anything themselves, it was the Americans who brought them the plan, and they graciously accepted it. Here's another quote from Lavrov. President Trump, and I'm not revealing any big secret here, has repeatedly said that this proposal of ours is partially a compromise. We accepted that this is a compromise proposal, and any agreement probably should contain an inevitable element of compromise. Trump stated that Kyiv would do what he proposed, but it didn't work out. In plain English, imagine, for example, Kremlin diplomats, superhuman. Lavrov assures that Donald Trump personally promised Vladimir Putin that he would pressure Ukraine and force Kyiv to surrender. But in the end, he says he couldn't do it. That's not how real tough guys act. He says the guy gave his word, but the guy didn't follow through. According to Lavrov, the problem wasn't in the agreements themselves, but at the implementation stage, which Washington was responsible for. Supposedly, the Russians were waiting for Trump to finally make Kyiv make concessions to Putin, but Trump allegedly failed at this task. And then the press drunkard Mashka Zakharova got involved too? She ironically noted that no one expected to resolve the conflict in 30 minutes, hinting at that brief meeting between Lavrov and Rubio in Manila yesterday. And she immediately reminded everyone that Trump promised more than 80 times to end the war in 24 hours and highly praised the summit in Anchorage, but the guy said it and the guy didn't do it. Now let's figure out what agreements we're actually talking about, because that's fundamentally important for us. Officially, the Anchorage terms have never been disclosed. It wasn't about a finalized document, but rather a broad framework for ending the war. In other words, it was about discussions on what it might hypothetically look like. But in Moscow, they claimed that the presidents of Russia and the United States had supposedly agreed on the so-called Anchorage formula. And here's what it means. The transfer of all of Donbas to Russia, plus a freeze of the front line in the remaining areas. Sergei Lavrov himself previously said that the Anchorage agreements were based on two issues. Ukraine's refusal to join NATO and Russia retaining all the territories it has captured. And before that, Putin demanded that Kyiv withdraw Ukrainian troops from these so-called DPR and LPR republics, as well as from the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. Just like Putin. Now it's clear why Rubio says that for Ukraine this was unacceptable then, and will become even less acceptable now. If you follow this logic, Ukraine was being asked to hand over the entire Donbas to Putin, to legally renounce joining NATO, and to recognize the loss of its territories. And all this in exchange for just a ceasefire, which Russia observes only as long as it suits them. And importantly, there would be no punishment for the savage Russians. That's exactly why. That's why this whole arrangement collapsed. Not because Trump didn't try hard enough, but because Ukraine never intended to and still doesn't intend to surrender. And even if we hypothetically assume that Trump supposedly promised Putin to really put pressure on Kyiv and force Kyiv to surrender, it was pointless from the start because Kyiv has no intention of surrendering. And Lavrov's complaint to Trump basically comes down to one thing, like you promised to force Kyiv to surrender, but Kyiv wouldn't be forced to surrender. And against this backdrop, Elon Musk bursts into the conversation with a position that perfectly aligns with the Kremlin's line. Basically, the billionaire picked up Lavrov's arguments and spread them to a Western audience. In an interview with The Economist, to the editor-in-chief of the New York Nebdos, Elon Musk stated that the war in Ukraine will not end until Western countries make concessions to Russia. Here is a quote from Elon Musk. "I have long been advocating for peace. A few years ago, I wrote that some concessions to Russia are really necessary here. That doesn't mean I'm on Russia's side. I was just being pragmatic. Otherwise, people will be dying for years without achieving anything." And then he added that, in his opinion, his prediction eventually came true. And here's the most telling part. Listen closely here. According to him, Elon Musk is annoyed by two types of people. The first are sophisticated diplomats who negotiate in expensive restaurants while others suffer in conflict zones. That makes sense. The second one, now pay attention, is a quote, "Those who arrogantly claim that Moscow must leave the liberated territories." That was a quote. We should actually pause on this wording. Listen closely. Liberated territories. That's literally the language of Russian propaganda. Not occupied territories, not seized territories, but specifically liberated, says Elon Musk. And here Elon Musk just gave himself away by showing what kind of media he actually reads. That is, the richest man on the planet, the owner of the social network X, through which a huge share of the world's information passes, publicly uses Kremlin terminology about Ukrainian cities. But this is more than telling. Just think about it, Elon Musk. He said it without even thinking. He says liberated territories because he constantly reads this Russian propaganda. And well, it's stuck. It's the same as how some people manage to use the Russian phrasing V Donbass instead of Na Donbass. Who uses the phrase V Donbass? Russians. And those who repeat V Donbass, well, obviously they're just absorbing that propaganda. And so The Economist, when publishing this interview with Elon Musk, specifically reminded that Elon Musk last month briefly became the world's first trillionaire. And they urged, quote, to take his words seriously. So, as you understand, we're not talking about a random tweet, something written in the heat of the moment. No, this is the position of a person with enormous influence. And Russian state media have already spread his words as quotes across all their news feeds. And now Elon Musk is calling the occupied territories of Ukraine liberated. But let's analyze the situation rationally. Look at the structure that's taking shape. For the first time in a long while, the Kremlin is publicly attacking Donald Trump personally, even though he was the one they were counting on. This is a sign that Moscow's calculations didn't work out. Trump couldn't and didn't try to push Ukraine into some kind of Anchorage formula. Since that's the case, the Kremlin is looking for someone to blame and preparing the narrative that they are willing to make agreements. It's the Americans who backed out, like we were ready, but Trump just didn't play it straight. At the same time, Lavrov said the main point in that same quote. The task set by President Putin in June 2024 will be accomplished. That means there is no withdrawal of demands and no compromise. It's not about seeking a compromise, but about getting exactly the same thing, just by a different means. And here Western experts offer an interesting counterpoint. The head of the Russia and Eurasia department at the Rand Corporation think tank, Samuel Charap, writes in an op-ed for the Financial Times that the war has reached a point where it's time to start real negotiations and European states should seize the moment and take on a more active role. So his key thesis is as follows. Ukraine is currently in a strong position and this needs to be used at the negotiating table. And Charap believes that Russia has felt Ukraine's strength and may show more flexibility in real negotiations. And now Charap insists that without a diplomatic process right now, the improvement in Ukraine's relative position will most likely lead to further escalation or prolongation of the war rather than a ceasefire. So the question is whether this pressure will translate into negotiations on our terms, or will the Kremlin simply continue to stall and have time to adapt? But I should note right away that there are some questions about the RAND Corporation. There are also some questions about Samuel Charap, because sometimes he has shown rather pro-Russian rhetoric. That's why we need to treat this information carefully, in the sense of, isn't the Kremlin just trying to take a pause in the shelling of Russian territory? Isn't the Kremlin trying to pretend like, oh, we're ready for negotiations, but only if you please stop shelling Russian cities? Let me remind the Russians separately, since they still watch my broadcasts. Volodymyr Zelensky once publicly proposed, remember, it was before May 9th, he publicly suggested stopping the mutual shelling of Ukrainian and Russian cities. What did Putin do? He refused. Volodymyr Zelensky proposed to stop and declare a ceasefire regarding the shelling of the energy infrastructure of both countries. That is, Russia doesn't strike our power plants, and we, for example, don't strike oil refineries. What did Putin do? He refused. Volodymyr Zelensky publicly proposed to stop the fighting along the current line of contact, freeze the front line, and start negotiations. What did Vladimir Putin do? Of course, he refused. Draw your own conclusions, as they say. And one last thing for today. In parallel with the Moscow track, there is a second one which is much more important for us. Zelensky confirmed that he is preparing a visit to the United States of America and stated that the Americans have several plans to end the war, which they are ready to share. This was preceded by a conversation on July 22 with Trump's special representatives, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and on the Ukrainian side, the participants in this dialogue were, of course, Zelensky, Kirill Budanov, Sergei Kizlytsya, and Rustem Umerov. And also noteworthy is the statement by the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, on July 23, quote, "Trump is genuinely interested in peace in Ukraine, and right now is the best time for Russia to end the conflict. According to him, the U.S. is creating structural conditions to make a future peace agreement credible and possible." And regarding this visit of Volodymyr Zelensky to the United States of America and what specific plans the Americans will put on the table, we will do a separate in-depth episode on this YouTube channel that will be released late tonight. There's definitely something to discuss, so if you haven't already, subscribe to this YouTube channel now. In summary, after the failed negotiations between Lavrov and Rubio in Manila, the Kremlin switched to publicly attacking Donald Trump. Lavrov stated that Russia's conscience is clear, that they acted according to the principle, a man gives his word, a man keeps it. And the agreements fell through because of Washington, which promised to pressure Kiev but failed to do so. At the same time, Elon Musk publicly calls on the West to make concessions to Moscow and refers to our Ukrainian lands under occupation as liberated territories. But analyst Rent in the Financial Times says the exact opposite of what the Kremlin wants. Ukraine is strong right now, and that's why it's time to sit down at the negotiating table, but from a position of strength, not capitulation. But here's the main conclusion. While Sergei Lavrov talks about some kind of street code and Elon Musk talks about concessions, the real conversation is happening on a different track. Zelensky is flying to Washington, where he will be shown the American plans. That's where I think it will actually be decided how this war will end. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.